Okay, let's go to Hebrews chapter 12. Now, I pointed out before earlier that John MacArthur uses Hebrews 12:14 to prove Lordship salvation. So let's look at Hebrews 12:14. Pursue peace with all people and holiness, without which no one will see the Lord. And remember, he says eternal security is a great spiritual truth. But it should never be presented merely as a matter of being once saved, always saved, with no regard for what you believe or do. The writer of Hebrews 12:14 states frankly that only those who continue living holy lives will enter the Lord's presence. You see, he understands entering the Lord's presence with, we'll see the Lord here. Okay. Now, let's look at the context. The writer of Hebrews is addressing the purposes and responses to God's loving discipline in these believers' lives. If you read, again, verses 5 through 13, he's talking to them about the fact that God's chastening is done out of love. God's chastening marks them off as genuine children of God. He says in verse 10 that God does this for our profit, that we may be partakers of his holiness. That's what he's talking about. By way of content in this verse, is this verse about our relationship with the Lord and going to heaven, or is it about being a good testimony of Christ to others? Now notice, pursue peace with all people. Notice that's horizontal. And holiness, a godly life, without which no one will see the Lord. The idea is in your life. They're not going to see the Lord in your life if you are just creating conflict after conflict, when you're living a sinful life as a believer. They won't see the Lord in your life. That's the idea. He's not talking about going to heaven at all. He's already said they're believers, that chastening is proof of that, and to live in such a way that's holy and even pursuing peace with all people. And by the way, Paul makes it clear in Romans that we should live peaceably with all men if it is possible, because it's not always possible. Now notice the very next verse after verse 14. Now, if you notice closely, verse 14 ended with a colon. Now it continues, looking carefully, lest anyone fall short of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up cause trouble, and by this many become defiled. You see, in God's chastening process, in his disciplining process, which, by the way, isn't always negative, it can be positive. If you don't respond correctly to it, or if you don't respond correctly to people who bug you and bother you so that you pursue peace with them, verse 14, you can fall short of the grace of God, and a root of bitterness now springs up, and it causes you trouble, and by it many others become defiled as you share your bitterness through your mouth and you spray them with ketchup all over the place. You see, again, he's talking about responding to the Lord and a failure to do so by way of its effects upon others. You see, students, this verse states nothing regarding justification before God, but it is talking about something about justification before men, like James 2. That no one will see the Lord in your life. They won't think you're a righteous person. You won't be declared righteous before men if you don't pursue peace and holiness. That's why, have you ever heard before, you mean he's a Christian? I can remember one time, and I don't know that this man was ever really saved, because there are false professors, we know that. But there was a guy when I worked in the mines up on the Iron Range. This guy had the filthiest mouth, the most pornographic mind, and one day I got a chance to give him the gospel. And as I'm talking to him, he looks at me and he goes, I'm a deacon in the Baptist church. I wasn't expecting that one. Now, as I talked to him, I don't think he was saved. But I do know this, after I got saved and started attending a Bible church 2 or 3 blocks from my house, I began to realize, there were a number of my classmates that went to church there, and I would have never guessed those people were saved. I mean, they were at the keggers that I was at before I got saved. See, I didn't see the Lord in their life. I had never known that. I'd never guessed they were even saved because their walk was inconsistent with who they were in Christ. Now, in some cases, they did get in fellowship with the Lord. They repented and started to walk with him and grow in the Lord. And by the grace of God, there was great transformation in their life. But Hebrews 12:14 in context is taken out of context when it's understood by Lordship Salvationists to say, unless you live a holy life, you will not make it to heaven.